At one point, there's something happened, and you decided to quit Cal Poly and start SCI-Arc. What was the exact moment that I was talking a little bit to Shelley before we started this, and she said you might talk to us about that.
Well, I can talk to it briefly.
Briefly is fine.
Okay. Well, the three departments were doing fine. I mean, except that I asked at the beginning that architecture be no larger than 200 because that was the size of landscape and planning. Each time summer would take place and they would start to make their proposals, which came really from the administration above, the program would grow again. So from the time I came on in '68, there were 25 students, and in the 3.5 years that we were there, it had grown to 350. And once it grows to 350 and we're bigger than the others, then you have this problem of, I think, jealousy among the programs. The dean was being very divisive as well. He seemed to be trying to stir all that up, and I guess he had problems with me. For some reason, we never had words. I had fought for Bernard Zimmerman's tenure. That might have gotten him a little bit upset. But we would go into meetings and come out of meetings, and I'd give what I had to do to my secretary, or assistant as they're called now. And she always did a great job on it, and every time, another day later, Bill Dale would come in, who was the dean, and say, that isn't what we said in the meeting. And I said, well, that's the way I heard what was going on in the meeting. And this went on about 2-3 times. And so one day I called Bill into my office, which is sort of a reversal where the chair calls the dean in instead of the other way around. And I said, Bill, what are you doing? You're creating a very divisive situation here, and so forth and so on. It got a little heavier than that. I used a few stronger words. And and that was the first time we ever had this kind of an exchange. We had always been reasonably friendly before. A week later, he asked me to resign my position as chair. And I said, what for? It seems kind of strange over one issue that I don't agree with you on to start to change that. And I was a full professor tenured, so I didn't have to leave. And it grew into a whole cause célèbre. The students liked the program. They started doing graphic stuff all over the school. We had a Professor Adi Lati who was great at silk screening, and as you remember probably. And so there were images of me and this and all. It was really pretty wild. And so it grew into that, and then there was a big all-school meeting of that with Kramer, who was the president, who I didn't really know at all. My relationships were with LeBounty, who was the vice president. And so that didn't go well. I mean, during that meeting, I guess he asked me what my intentions were, and I said my intentions were to make Cal Poly one of the best schools in the country. And his answer to that was, we're not interested in Cal Poly being one of the best schools in the country. I said, well, I guess this certainly isn't the place I want to be then. And so anyway, the younger faculty who weren't tenured, and I and Shelley and
Glenn.
Well, Glenn wasn't tenured yet either. So we all got together and one day decided, why don't we just start our own school? We had met quite a few times with the students out on campus. They were building these rhombic dodecahedrons, and they were placed on the campus, and we wanted to explore some behavioral close packing ideas. And that sort of became the rallying point for all of this. And after those meetings, the students got more excited about the whole idea. And that's when then we left. That's the story. It was rather quick and simple. and I found that all tenured faculty back away when they're asked to support anybody because they're afraid of their own positions. So when I started SCI-Arc, we set up a whole different kind of a program.
But you also brought with you a certain image, certain culture of both for the faculty and the students. And when I first walked into SCI-Arc, I remember very well that there were spaceship models hanging from the ceiling, the airplane parts, the wings, and all that. And the place didn't look like a school, so there was the love at first sight for me. And there are a lot of this new or going into sort of an unknown, risky business, perhaps, in comparison to structured curriculum of typical architecture schools. As I remember, there was only SCI-Arc and AA in London that had some kind of an affinity in terms of what you could do with the education, architect's education. So there was this very definite forward-looking school. That was my first immediate impression, and I think the school still banks on that image. And there were few key people. There were you and Shelley, but I want to bring his name up here, and I will ask you a question about this person, Glenn Small, our friend. And Glenn was responsible for a lot of that sort of energy as well. Could you talk a little bit about that, what he brought in terms of the school?
To SCI-Arc or to Cal Poly?
To the world.
To both. Okay. Well, one thing, and this wasn't with Glenn particularly, but at Cal Poly we did a lot of inflatable work and so forth. That was with the group Chrysalis, that was connected to Archigram or had been taught by Archigram. So we did a lot of things there that were sort of experimental and fun. Okay, the rhombic dodecahedron, the close packing thing that took place was really my idea, but Glenn and Adi and Bill Simonian carried it through at Cal Poly, and that was the first. The idea was to build out of plywood, minimum waste, no waste really. They built it that way, and a lot of that was Glenn. I mean, he was the instigator. When we got to SCI-Arc again, of course, Glenn and Adi taught the first year program, and that program was meant to really get the students excited about things. So they built tents, they traveled through the city. You probably remember a lot of that.
I do.
There was paper structures. There were these, just lots of things. And Glenn was, he's a very talented guy. I hired him initially because his drawings were fantastic. He had beautiful drawings, and he was, his ideas were a little beyond reality, but they were fun.
It's very interesting.
By a more biosphere was, up a mile in the sky over the whole city of LA. I mean, that was his thesis project at Cranbrook. But beyond that, I mean, he had a lot of other ideas, and his ideas were ones that I enjoyed and I felt strongly about.
It's interesting enough that the last one he was here, and he was invited by SCI-Arc, and one of the well-known architecture critics, Jeffrey Kipnis. I don't know if you have any interaction with him.
I've never had interaction.
Is somewhere between being very precise and also somewhat know how to carry on the sort of fun type of criticism that goes serious and fun in the same time. Anyway, he comes up to Glenn and says, how does it feel to be 40 years too early? One of your larger scale projects, the transportation center in Santa Monica, it was one of the buildings that I really enjoy. Even today, that I will, whenever I'm in Santa Monica, I will go by and look at it. And can you talk a little, because it was a kind of a pioneering building at the time. It was in 1980s?
1980, yeah.
Yeah, and it was one of those buildings fully integrated solar strategies and, environmental, the conserving strategies. And at the time, it was not necessarily, even though it's only 30 years ago, it was not a very popular thing. I remember some very famous architects today that they wanted to evict that kind of ideas from their projects because it didn't look good. And but you went ahead and did it.
Yeah, well, for us it was a really nice opportunity, because it was a good scale. One, we could use the analogy of the bus as part of the idea and get into metal skins, which I hadn't had an opportunity to do before. Have a building that looked technologically a little more like, tech. But the solar stuff and the environmental was key in the whole process too. So the building really went from, it was sort of a 24-hour building because some of the bus drivers were there at night and some, they moved. And so the way the sun moved was sort of the way the building worked. And then we also we daylighted. I wanted to not have any air conditioning in the building and that we would scoop air from the ocean, but the engineer wouldn't go along with that, and so they put on some air conditioning units. But in that location, I think it would have worked well because I designed it with a plenum that would gather this air and then be brought back into the unit in a good way. So the building really worked, I think, all the way around. The west sun was allowed to gather in the afternoon because the room next to it was the night room, and so we would gain that heat and that would be then brought in. But that all started with me in 1975 when the Energy Code changed in the state of California, and all my projects from 75 to 85 roughly always dealt with energy ideas and strategies. And I was curious if it really affected what a building looks like. And in a sense, it doesn't have to. I mean, I oriented buildings differently. Material-wise, you would use whatever, same as I would have before in many ways. The buildings didn't look like typical energy buildings that were being done at that time. There was a group I think more in the Southwest. Those buildings were usually in the ground in some way or using trom walls, and that was about the end of it, and they all kind of looked in sort of a similar way. The buildings I was doing, I think, really had their same characteristics that they would have had, but would be oriented in a way that they would work better. So it was just another exploration for me. My life in architecture has really been worked on probably two ideas. In the early 60s, I wanted to get into modular housing. I had made proposals, and I had a scheme that I wanted to have done, and then I started doing my private houses with that attitude. I couldn't do. It doesn't make sense to do a one-off prefab. That's one of the problems. And so, but I was studying it more from a standpoint of how do you break a building down volumetrically, and how do you get more space out of it without it being box-like and being in a module. And so that was, it took, well, how many years? You say you're 40 years ahead of your time. It took till 2004, from about 64, that's 40 years, to get a chance to finally try it, And that was when, with Living Homes, I was able to do a similar bit. I mean, there were some changes, but similar to what I had proposed, and I was able to get a pretty good space out of a modular house, I think, and that was probably the strength of that particular project. But the years, I mean, it's when, if I can drop back in the planning area, in the urban design area, I mean, we used to propose so many things in the 60s, and they still aren't in place. It takes 30, 40, 50 years for things to happen. So things like that don't happen too quickly. So it becomes a question, does that make sense to always be looking to the future and how you propose in the future? Or is it better really, to act in the present, which is more realistic, because the other never seems to happen unless you just enjoy doing it. And I guess I enjoyed that for many years. And we tried. We had transportation systems. We had lots of things. We tried to sell it to the state legislature. I mean, I used to be a lot more energetic than I am now. And we'd go out and really work hard, but we couldn't get anybody to come get behind. We'd go over to RAND, we'd go to the other think tanks around us in Santa Monica and try to get people there interested. Nobody was ever interested. So it's just very, very difficult to get things off the ground that way. Unless I don't know what it would be like today, because today or in recent years, you have so many billionaire investors in the country, who are interested in investing in ideas, even if they know they're going to fail, which is rare. That wouldn't be the case, 40 years ago. Today, they figure if they get 1 out of 10, they might hit a big winner, and make themselves another $1 billion, and they don't care if they lose on the other 9.
What would be a winning trend today in architecture? Let's say I have.
In architecture, I know my thinking was always in planning more than it was in urban issues than it was in architecture.
Well, okay, then.
In architecture, I do the same thing now I did in the 60s most of the time, because that's the only thing that people come back to me for. And so I don't look at, I see what the students do today, and with their, from the computer modeling that they can do, and having computer programs like Maya, et cetera, that give them formal projects that are mind-blowing, in a way. I mean, it's just a different way of approaching architecture, totally. So what comes out of that is, who knows? I mean, if they're entrepreneurial enough to get them be able to do some of the stuff, or if they get into firms where that's possible, obviously, there's going to be more and more interesting kinds of buildings. It's not my kind of architecture. I mean, but it's the kind of thing that I think probably is going to happen, and it's not, it's not so different from going back to Glenn Small again, what Glenn used to do with his little models and hyperbolic stuff and all the, the kinds of forms and shapes that he was able to do in without the computer. And so, but now with the computer, when I go to SCI-Arc once in a while to look at what's being done, It's amazing to me what the students do. I don't know what they can do in real architecture, but in
But the thing is,
in fantasy land in the movies, it looks good.
it's not only in SciArc anymore. It's in every school.
Every school.
It's,
No, I know
it's-
that,
it's-
but I
it's
don't go to
that.
every school. I'm just
But
saying.
here's the question, right? Since it's like in every school, it's like that. You see a whole, huge production of this kind of work that made possible with the technology, but there are very few examples of that are. It hasn't really unified with the people yet. That it always speaks to either a power structure or a wealth structure and all that. And do you see any kind of a way all this sort of advancements can come back and reconcile people with architecture?
Well, I don't know that I agree with you on that. I mean, I don't know how you categorize, let's go to Frank's buildings, that's what always happens. But if you go to Bilbao, that spoke to a hell of a lot of people. People I would never have guessed would even, like that architecture at all. So, and obviously Disney Hall does. So, I mean, these are buildings that I think people relate to. Certain people do, and I think younger people particularly do. Younger generations. Not so much, again, in housing or the house, but in, museums and theaters and buildings that are that scale or larger exhibition spaces and so forth. I think people relate to that. And I'd love to do community scale work. I'd prefer to work for the public, but how do you get that work? And if you want to get public work today, I'm down at UC San Diego on the design review board down there, and I watch what goes on at a university. I mean, for every project that comes in, there's 55 architects going after that one job, and major firms with major portfolios, and
Bidding on
hoping to get in, and then it's knocked down to maybe 3-4 that come in out of that, where you might have 25 of those are all qualified, 30 might be qualified, and then you're down to 4 or 5. And all the buildings down there, of course, now are mostly laboratory buildings. So if you haven't done 20 laboratory buildings, it's pretty hard to get a job. That goes on for. I don't know how many people here are architects, but and maybe in that game, but it's tough. It's really tough marketing today. I didn't have to market my whole life, really. But if I had to market today, I'd find it really, really, really hard, because you walk into a room and there's people, 10 people looking at you, and you don't know one from the other, and you're supposed to make this proposal, and you're trying to guess, maybe what they might be thinking in their heads, unless you have any previous experience with them, and that's not easy to do. And so one group comes in, they come in all suited up and da-da-da, and the group that's watching them says, I don't like those guys are too, how do you define people who come in suits? Okay. And then another group, is very casual. Oh, they're great. So it's how they're looking, it's what they're addressing, it's how they say what they do, it's what the team is. There's got to be one of these and one of those and one of this. It's a tough game. It's a tough game out there if you're trying to get that kind of work. And most architects know that they're going to get, if they get 1 out of I don't know what. If they get 1 out of 10, I think they think
it's very successful.
They're
1 out of 10 is good.
They're doing really great. So firms spend a great deal of their time making proposals, period. And that isn't, I don't think that's terribly fun to do. But that's what goes on.
That's what it is.
Yeah, but I don't think you can fault the system. I was one who always, all my life, was an empiricist, so I never trusted this or that, and so I had to go through the process to decide whether it was right or wrong. That's what I tried to do at SCI-Arc. I thought, well, there must be another way to educate besides the way we do it. What will happen if we open up the whole thing wide open? Where will it go? It ends up going pretty close to what it did before, and I think that's true in society in general. When you try to make the change, it seems to come around back kind of to the same damn place, and so that gets a little frustrating that you can't move things the way you would like to move them through as long as you have a democratic process. I mean, if you have a completely autocratic process, you have a better chance. But even there, look at our world today.
I think you just described the most frustrating part of architectural practice. Most architects that I know of, that they all feel the similar sort of helplessness, almost not getting into it. But I think it's changing. However,
that's because you're younger than I am.
but there are people who are younger.
And these guys, I'm sure, think it's
there are people younger than me.
And I hope it does.
Who are camping right now in across from City Hall. I'm very hopeful about those people.
Right.
I mean, besides MTV wants to make money on them and that. But Ray, we are coming to the close, and I'm going to open this conversation to the audience, and they're going to ask questions. But before, I don't want us to go out like this on this kind of how to make money thing. When I first walked into your house, immediately, I went to my typewriter, computer, and I wrote this, and you're one of the people that is kind of uncanny about. I know you work from the rational end. You put the program together. You work all the tangents of clients and all that. But there's a very poetic side to your work, and it comes out so naturally. Probably you don't even plan on it because that's how you are. And I wrote, Kappy houses are interesting in that they visually take you to places without you physically moving an inch. His spaces don't stop. You can look, but you won't see a line that doesn't depart, travel, connect, or fly away into the canyons. He's daringly modern, moving you through the bottlenecks of organized combustion before dropping you in his poetry of space, architectural construction, scale, light, and experiment. Am I close on this, or am I just...
Perfect.
Okay.
I certainly couldn't say it that well. No, I don't know. I think beyond the rational, there's the intuitive, and what happens is that's the person. Okay, and as you say, it happens because of the way a person is, and that just, that's just the way it works for me. I start in a very simple way. I don't consciously try to push everything to somewhere, and but it sort of happens. I'm a person, I think I've said it lots of times, I like structure, but I like to be able to break structure. And I think I'm sort of in the middle that way. I don't try to do everything, make it new, make it something else. I have nothing wrong. I think, I believe in continuity. And I always believed in the continuity of the modern movement, and because it had lots of variations to work within. And but at the same time, I think you can set up a set of rules, but they get broken in certain ways at certain times, and that's what makes the job interesting. And that some of that is just happening. Some of it is intuitive, as I said, and some of it is I don't know. You just don't know. I've been surprised lots of times in my work. I think most architects do. Sometimes you can't call. It's pretty hard to know everything that's going to happen. You certainly can't figure out every reflection that's going to happen when you put in some glass and how that changes your perception and so forth. Neutra always like to use mirrors like outside there and so forth to change perception. I didn't like that because I always thought it was a little bit pushing in the wrong way. But I did always like glass because glass reflects in a similar way and sometimes can almost mirror. But you're not putting the glass in necessarily to do that. You're usually putting the glass in to be able to look outside to nice trees, what's happening externally. And what happens on the glass sometimes is quite a surprise. As the light changes from one side to the other, you get reflections back and forth. And that's the wonder of it all. And the way as the seasons change and the sun comes in and the moon comes up and all this kind of stuff. I mean, that's what's fun to me. And a lot of that is you can't, you could figure it out, but I don't think there's too many architects. They don't even want to figure out how you build the building, let alone how all the sun is going to come in at every point and do what it's going to do. I mean, we just don't, there aren't that many who are really research oriented to that degree that they could spend that much time. I don't think that's where architects get their total enjoyment. But what you get from it is, I think, exciting, and a lot of times you don't have to figure it all out, and things happen.